Chapter 28, The Spheres. And the shapes of the locusts were like unto horses prepared unto battle, and on their heads were, as it were, crowns like gold, and their faces were as the faces of men. And they had hair as the hair of women, and their teeth were as the teeth of lions. And they had breastplates, as it were, breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was as the sound of chariots of many horses running to battle. And they had tails like unto scorpions, and there were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men 5 months. And they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon. Revelation 9, 7 through 11. Ethan reached the globe at the far end of the chamber first. There was a definite path. It differed from what looked downright organic, undulating across the majority of the seemingly living cavern. The impenetrable fluid, a substance like the mouth of a clam that could swallow a town. This path down its middle was relatively flat, but that didn't really matter. The whole structure continued to wobble for reasons Ethan didn't bother to speculate about. Along the side of the path, like a ridge of bone through the madness, was some sort of veiny pipeline, organic, reflective, and pale, and about the height of a man, rather like a culvert. It continued forward to the far part of the chamber that was their aim, the lesser sphere. They were 100 feet from this lesser sphere when the Grinners began to emerge behind. Carl's walkie buzzed with Ed's voice. The Grinners showed up. Ethan took a few shots, as did Carl, and they double-timed it. A point of weak light shone from underneath the smaller sphere, dwarfed by the pearl in the center, a monster in its own right that stretched 100 feet into the air. Emerging into the globe that glowed a faint yellow, Carl and Ethan saw thousands of women in a continuous spiral that started at the roof and wound all the way down until they were fed into the cylinder like a drainage pipe at the bottom. It took roughly a minute for each unconscious woman to totally disappear inside said pipe. They were plastered on the walls as though there were no gravity, all facing the center of the space, and a very wide space it was. The women had tubes connected to their faces, and the otherworldly white cheese-like substance held them against whatever method of conveyance wound them around a cyclone assembly line. At the top of the chamber was an empty bit of area in a roughly rectangular shape. Likely, several women should have been there, keeping the slowly winding chain continuous, but their deposit had been halted by Carl and Co., leaving the gap. Behind the gap was a circular opening that was the ostensible beginning of the line. There were gaps between groups of 10 to 15 women here or there at intervals throughout the sphere, places where a lady at one point in the month might best fit. The way the system shuffled them in was a mystery to Ethan, as was the entire spectacle. "Where's Genevieve?" Carl said immediately. He pulled Slinky from his shoulder and let her trot to the length of her leash, where she stopped and sat about 6 feet away. He gripped the leash in his right hand, looking around carefully. "You see red hair, tell me, fam, that's Chloe Claire." Carl's eyes flicked back and forth across the thousands in the spiral. "God, please tell me she has not passed through." Except for the space directly adjacent to the pipe, you couldn't move for the winding line of unconscious females. They covered every part of the globe's inside. "We gotta turn this thing off," Ethan observed. Carl looked at him, then crouched down and glanced behind. The Grinners would be there in minutes. It was a bottleneck, but numbers would overwhelm it. Carl pulled out the walkie. "Ed, see if you can draw fire." It took a few seconds, but at length Ed's voice came, out of breath and doused in static. "Copy." The walkie dripped enough Carl was able to shake it off, then remembered the linguistic effects of the water and tapped the drops into his mouth instead. After this, he got down on his stomach and started taking careful aim with his .45. "Ethan, you're right. Turn it off," he said, then started blasting. Ethan did his best not to flinch at the loud report of the gun as it echoed through the spherical chamber. Several of the women jerked in their trappings, and in one instance Ethan saw a golden flash. Then a lady snapped into consciousness, mumbling in muffled cries until she could pull the tube from her mouth, whereupon she began to choke, then to yell, and then to struggle free while shrieking in between staccato recitations of the word "Help!" Ethan looked back, and up, and up. She was far away into the sphere, much too far to address right away. Carl glanced back fast, squinted, confirmed it wasn't Genevieve, then returned to dusting Grinners. Ethan cupped hands around his mouth, yelled, "We're gonna try, fam!" He jumped up on the portion of the large tube into which the women were being drawn. He leaned over the front end to see down the length of it, and an alien gray like none he had seen came skittering out at him over the comatose females. This monster had black eyes and a gray body, and that body looked very much like an arachnid's. Imagine a centaur if you replaced the human torso with a sexless alien gray, and instead of horse haunches, a spider's massive bumbling caboose. The chief difference from it being a spider was that instead of thread drifting from its backside, the creature was hooked to a cable about as thick around as a coffee can. The cable moved elastically with the creature and was quite long, doubtless rooted elsewhere in alien infrastructure. Ethan backed up in a hurry and pulled his gun out. Carl saw in time and yelled, "Don't! You could hit Genevieve, or what's her name? Chloe!" Ethan dodged out of the way of the strange creature. "By Christ, be gone!" Nothing happened. "Carl, it didn't respond to Jesus!" Carl turned around and made a similar command. Nothing happened. He said, "It must be total mechanics, not any living thing at all. Ethan, see the cable. Trade me." Carl pulled a substantial knife from somewhere and tossed it to Ethan. Ethan tossed him his sonic weapon. The thing hissed and skittered around, now some distance from Ethan, stepping carefully over the slowly moving rows of unconscious abductees, intent on the circular exit of the globe at the top. It moved with inhuman swiftness despite its precise footing. "The thing must tend to him somehow," Ethan observed. He took the knife. Carl took the knife and dove at the cable. Hold on a sec. Ethan took the knife and dove at the cable attached to it, managing to wrap his legs around it like a wrestler as it slithered and drew him along. Whatever material composed it was tough, but no tougher than rubber. Ethan was able to cut right through it, exposing a stinking putrid array of liquid compounds that could have been anything, but came out in combination with a hot steam. The spider creature scrambled around the chamber toward the exit at the top for a moment more, its severed end dragging over unconscious integrated women, leaking goop on them. Then, abruptly, it stopped, leaned onto a side of the chamber, and sagged. The whole sphere shook. All the tubes on all the faces of the women retracted back, and gasps could be heard around the room, some of them resulting in staccato flashes of gold, others failing to interrupt unconsciousness. The globular room had been glowing a mild yellow. Now it faded to pink, and the tortoise slow motion of the spiral came to a complete stop with a woman halfway down the tube. She was the last to have the tube from her face retracted. It imploded into itself until it became a cable, and then merged with the moving belt, whatever it was, dragging the women to the great spinning pearl beyond. "Carl, we got it stopped." "Okay, help me here, kid. Trade you back for the gun." Ethan gave him the knife and took aim with his sonic weapon. It was hard. The Grinners were coming in bands of about 5, and there were several dozen bands. Carl was a decent shot. He only missed sporadically. Even so, he was already on clip number 5. Ethan had a harder time, but still managed to dust a few. Abruptly, several fell sideways before the particulate transformation act, and it became apparent Ed was in range. Now the lines of Grinners stopped, crouched, and divided their attention, which had been Carl's initial strategy. They had made a few shots that came close, but Carl was in an impossible place, and they were taking fire from 2 angles. The Grinners hit the ground, but then things got complicated. Outside, trailing a line of cylinders like a streamer and covered in them around its ambulating massive legs like barnacles on pier piles, the conch ziggurat had reached the edge of the dried-up sea and was climbing over the steep hills leading away from it. It was headed for the living sea, the sea of knowledge, as Carl had called it. This forward ambulation was changing internal gravitational orientation. The ache men, called Grinners, started to slide, several of them realizing the issue too late and stumbling into the great rolling pearl at the center, becoming stuck, then being drawn quickly into the mass where they were subsumed to become hydrogen peroxide, faces in a rictus of indescribable horror. Others slid off the path into the slippery knot liquid that made up the majority of the chamber's floor. Then pale men in varying states of attire from varying eras in history came sliding down, among them clever Ed, who managed to start sprinting toward Carl and Ed in the sphere. Falling forward, doing his best to control where he stepped and keep from falling, Ed saw a great bright line at the far end of the chamber like a sun. It was becoming brighter and more robust as the angle changed, but an image was coming, resolving in the distance through the light. Something had been triggered. When Ed reached the path, he had to run down it at a sideways angle as one descends a steep hill, aiming an odd shot at the grinners as he did, barely managing to keep from falling. The ambling pale men behind followed closely as they were able, but if they couldn't, they let their momentum carry them right into the discomfited grinners. Ed dove through the opening. Carl caught his hand. They helped him through. And then another man came after, one of the pale ones, missing patches of hair. Carl and Ethan immediately recognized him and almost shot him, Ethan yelling, "Ed, you got a parasite! Stop! It's my son!" "What?" Blake Fogarty. "He goes by Farley," Ethan interrupted. "He's half the reason we're in this mess. No cap." "Guys, I'm on your side," Farley said, pulling himself into the leaning chamber and resting against the entryway. "I just want to find Chloe." "Yeah, you would." Ethan brought the gun up. "Ethan!" Ed jumped in front of it. Ethan let it down, glaring. "Let's just find them." Carl was behind them in the chamber, looking at every face of every unconscious woman intently. They turned and began following his lead, combing through the many females, waking them up if they could, but moving quickly. The flashes of gold kept coming. They could hear conversations in multiple languages as women awoke. Then Carl exclaimed, "Jim!" He was halfway across the room, having tiptoed between the women as best he could in the altered orientation of the space. Genevieve was only a few hours away from the pipe end of the sphere. They would not have been able to delay the rescue attempt much longer. Ethan yelled, "You find her!" "I found her." "Okay, let me find Chloe. I'll get the kittens out." Ethan searched desperately, and finally he saw her bright red hair way up on the far wall, almost upside down. If not for the super building, climbing the hill, and the changing orientation of the sphere, she would have been impossible to reach. As it was, getting to her would be no picnic. Farley said, "She'll be hard to get to. I'll help." Ethan looked at him skeptically, but he did appear, if not changed, at least humbled. Ethan said, "Okay," and between them they managed to make the climb and pull her out of the cheese. She did not wake, but was breathing, and did not stop breathing. Ethan scrambled down, helping Farley carry her unconscious body the whole way until they were at the bottom of the sphere again. Carl stood. He had Genevieve in a fireman's carry. She was stirring faintly, alive, but also not yet conscious. "Ethan, over here. This is where the other portal is. Get out the cat with the wall eyes." Ethan and Farley stumbled over with Chloe, who was Claire, while Ed continued to cover the exit. He yelled over his shoulder, "Guys, we ought to let people who woke up through." Indeed, women had started crawling down from the sides of the globe, and it was becoming increasingly loud. A crowd was growing, and they all seemed intent on where Carl was. Carl said, "As many as we can." Ethan pulled out Cletus, scratching the head of Stubby in his other pocket. He gave Cletus a piece of jerky and placed him in a spot about 40 feet into the globe. Cletus purred and immediately opened 4 portals in the same spot. The space where they led was dark, and the size of the fissure was much larger than any of the other cats could manage. You could drive a Mack truck through the portal Cletus opened. Slinky made a loud noise where she stood by Carl as he held Genevieve. It sounded suspiciously proud, as though she felt she had taught the little kitten well. Carl, Genevieve, and Cat jumped quickly through. Farley said to Ethan, "I'll help. Get her through," and adjusted his hold on Chloe. "Keep an eye on the exit," and he pointed to the entry of the chamber. The second Ethan looked, Clever Ed and Farley jumped through into the darkness with the unconscious Chloe, who was Claire. What Ethan didn't see was that Farley shooed the cat in with his foot as he and Ed stepped inside. Immediately the portal closed. Ethan was shocked into panic for an instant. This was further exacerbated by an additional tilt in the orientation of the Conch Ziggurat. It had started tilting the other way now, down the range of hills, and people started tumbling from the walls the other direction. "Jesus, don't leave me hanging, fam! Help!" The cat in his vest screamed reciprocally, reminding him, "That's right, I carry a spare." And he brought out Stubby. "Sorry, Stubby." And he yeeted the cat at the portal spot, diving after simultaneously as a rip in space and time split the mad world. The stakes suddenly changed. In the great ovular chamber of the Conch Ziggurat, the huge sphere spinning slowly in the center came to a stop, and flashes of gold began to percolate around the space in a passable impression of fireworks, coming together at the far end in a great flickering conglomeration of light that was a massive portal stretching across the writhing, not liquid floor like its own pool. A deep voice proclaimed the following mellifluously, a golden bell in a base timber that shook the soul. The stolen light restricted and the machinations stop. Now the prayers have been answered, so incarceration stops. Into the light, to the table of the stone, where the pillar of the world that was is known, and yet unknown. Go! And every awakened person heard the word in his or her own tongue as they stumbled into the open space and toward the mighty fissure. The women came from the lesser sphere. The men gained strength with each new breath, and in several minutes' time they were streaming through the fissure, which gave on a flat, rocky plain full of wind, but a warm summer wind. Within several days, sporadically, several hundred confused men and women found themselves calling for help atop Devil's Tower in Wyoming before the fissure fully closed behind. The incident immediately drew the full attention of the government, one or two intrepid scientists making the mistake of entering back into the fissure before it finally closed, for it did take days to divest that chamber in the center of the conch. The entire area became restricted for several months as a result. Thankfully, bureaucracy is slow, or perhaps more fools would have been taken into the void. If response had been properly managed, whole expeditions would have been lost in the conch ziggurat as it changed state. The portal above Devil's Tower was hardly open a week. A week that was only minutes in that other world of supernatural creation beyond time and space, the one existing like its own unique place and filled with the strange. The great conch ziggurat, larger than life, came down the other side of the hills that bracketed the Dead Sea like a volcano's caldera, and had been a natural barrier around where waters were drained by the very super-building ambling away now. It made its way to the Sea of Knowledge, crawling out until it reached a sufficient depth, about a fifth the way up its colossal legs. It crouched down and began to initiate a rolling motion, sort of like a top, or perhaps a weighted figurine with a face painted on that has been designed to maintain vertical alignment no matter how it is pushed. It rolled about in the water, trying to clean itself of the foam still dribbling out its open end. This initiated quite a flurry of violent waves and shook the whole area. All the while, beneath the great structure, a maelstrom of fallen angels undulated in proximity to its curved belly, becoming like a nuclear flame as they whirled with increasing speed. Soon the building stopped its rotation and righted itself on its 6 massive legs. One or two of the cylinders, barnacled about those legs, had fallen away, but most remained. Now the structure stabilized, and a horrid deep sound, followed by a wind, swept through the area for miles, further enraging the waves. Then there was a noise like a bomb, which was quickly followed by a substantial earthquake, and a void of water in 6 spots so substantial liquid surged over hills hundreds of feet high followed. The waves prevailed over the lip of the faux caldera to moisten the empty seabed. The conch ziggurat had gathered all remnants of energy it had stolen from those abducted for the purposes of fallen angels, those antagonists of mankind who fashion themselves greater than they are even as they steal the designs of the Almighty. That stolen energy was gathered, consolidated, compressed, pressured, and prepared for its final purpose, a leap to the end of all things. Before it sprang, the awakened were released in accordance with the laws of their own world of spiritual bizarro physics. Through the final fissure in the center of the structure, they were ejected beyond the planet of impending dawn of the world between worlds. Now the conch ziggurat made its own escape, and so soared high through the atmosphere. As it rose, the variable force of its 6 legs turned it into a corkscrew, and the hundreds of massive cylinders tracked into the structure began to glow a deep blue, generating an anti-gravitational field that soon silhouetted the entire conical shape. In a further instant, it took off through the last vestiges of stratosphere, arcing across the universe to the end of time, where the greatest fissure was even now closer to opening than it had ever been. The final rip in space and time that gave on the painting by God we call our universe, a trans-temporal fruit that ripens all the time, waiting only on that final week of Daniel to be plucked, and nearer such circumstance every second. The women who remained in the pearl of the conch ziggurat would produce the hybrid offspring of the rebels soon, like demon locusts from the void. The blocking of the light, before the dawning of the day, within the spiral of the conch, had been foretold. Indeed, the time was near. The conch Ziggurat sprang to the abyss, and the army that waits there. But it would not arrive for some time.